Welcome back to Misguided the Podcast, where we explore the latest insights from social science to understand why we believe what we do, how misinformation spreads, and what we can do to think more critically. I am your host, Matthew Facciani, and today I'm excited to be joined by science writer and author Kavin Senapathy. Kavin has spent years bridging the gap between science, health, and public discourse, tackling some of the most controversial and misunderstood topics, whether it's vaccines, parenting, or how we decide who we trust in the digital age. Her latest book, The Progressive Parent, explores the intersection of science, social justice, and raising kids in a world filled with misinformation. In this episode, we dive into what led her to science communication, the challenges of parenting in an era of information overload, and how we can develop a more nuanced understanding of trust in health and science institutions. We also discuss the broader implications of scientific literacy, not just for parents, but for anyone invested in the future of critical thinking and public health. So whether you're a parent, an educator, or just someone interested in how misinformation shapes our world, there's a lot to take away from today's discussion. Let's get into it. For our listeners new to your work and to your writing, I just wanted to talk about what led you into science communication in the first place.
Yeah, I'm asked this question a lot, and I say that I've always been very interested in science and health, and I've been really interested in writing and communication just sort of innately. So to give you an idea, when I was in high school, I was part of the high school poetry and prose club where we did shared new writing every week. And then I also won the statewide Wisconsin medical spelling bee because I loved medical
awesome.
Terminology. So I've always kind of just had that sort of brain, but it wasn't until I gave birth for the first time in 2011 that that everything kind of gelled. Essentially what happened is I had a pretty intense case of what's called postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder. So this is basically OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, around which there are already so many misconceptions, but that occurs after someone gives birth. And so, of course, normally new parents are pretty scared because it's a pretty kind of unnerving time in one's life. But for me, it was out of control fear and anxiety. So long story short, once I realized that what I was going through was not normal and sought help for that, I wasn't diagnosed with OCD actually until 2014. So I thought this was anxiety, but anyhow, I was prescribed an SSRI, which helped quite a bit. And that allowed me to get stable enough footing where I realized that this kind of fear and the fear mongering that's targeted at parents is so prevalent. And what I did over almost a year or two was retaught myself how to look at claims that are supposedly science-based and digging into the actual evidence and research behind it. And in 2013, I started blogging for a blog called Grounded Parents. And from there, I started writing professionally, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's great. Yeah, because I found some of your earlier work on like GMOs, vaccines, and then most recently you wrote this great book, The Progressive Parent. So it's interesting that parenthood shaped you into going in the science communication direction, and now it's culminated directly into a parenting book.
Yeah.
So did you write about parenting like a lot before, or is this book like the first time you've really focused on it for a writing project?
So interestingly enough, I would say that this book it's in the parenting section, but I wouldn't necessarily call it a parenting book. I've written about the well-being of children for a long time. And that's pretty much what this book is about. And interestingly enough, my original book proposal was not a book that would be in the parenting section. The working title of that book proposal was In This House, We Believe Science is Real. And it's a take on the, to some people, famous yard sign that has a few different values listed on it. In this house, we believe love is love, Black Lives Matter, science is real, no human is illegal, and kindness is everything. And so I wanted to dig into what this means to people, this idea that we believe in a house or in a car with a bumper sticker or whatever, that science is real, and what it has to do with the rest of those values. And so the publisher that we ended up going with, and I had a great editor as well, was very interested in my proposal, but asked if we could do the same thing, but with more of a focus on kids and parenting. And so that was definitely a full circle moment. To your question, I wrote a lot more about parenthood specifically in the earlier years of my science writing career. And then since then, I've written about health and research that applies to people of all ages. But this was definitely a full circle moment writing this book, for sure.
Yeah, that's really cool. So if you could talk a little bit more about this book, like you mentioned how it kind of came to be, what are some of the main takeaways you would want someone who's a parent or also not a parent when they read this book? How should they approach it, or do you hope they approach it?
Yeah, for sure. I would say this book is, it's certainly for parents, but especially in 2024, we live in a time where so many of my peers are making the intentional decision to not procreate, biologically at least. Yet all adults I know have an influence in some child's life, whether they're an aunt or uncle or an educator or, their friends have kids. So the book is for anybody who cares about the future of humanity, essentially. And it's about worldviews and about teaching people how to have another layer of scrutiny when it comes to implementing their values, when it comes to their decision making and how they interact with children and how they interact with their peers. And so I'm not sure, I know you just read the book, but for people who haven't, the table of contents might seem as if the book covers a whole bunch of disparate issues that are not connected. So you see healthy scrutiny of science, navigating race and ethnicity, gender, clean living, and I think it might be showing backwards to you. I don't know.
No, it looks good. Yeah.
Okay. And vaccines and greenwashing. So all of these seem kind of disconnected, but there are a couple of themes that tie them together. And one of the big ones is really this onus on individual parents to, as they say, take control of their children's health, and whether that onus is reasonable or realistic or not, depending on the question at hand.
Yeah, I really like how you tied it all together at a broader level, because when I was looking at the table of contents, I'm like, wow, this is a lot of different topics.
Yeah.
But it was cool how it came together and combining a scientific worldview with a progressive-minded worldview, and then also looking at the intersection for specific topics, like how there's science showing how different marginalized groups might have worse health outcomes, and like what that means if we care about science and equity and equality. And like you said, it covers a lot of things related to parenting, but whenever I was reading it as a misinformation person, someone who studies misinformation, I was always thinking about the misinformation side of it.
Sure.
And I guess that was kind of leads me to my next question. What do you think are some of the main areas of parenting that you think there's not enough good information out there, or it's confusing to parents? Or, you covered some topics here, but in your research, what are some of the main things you'd like to address that you think are particularly important.
On another note, I would just love to talk to you sometime about your perspective on this book as a misinformation researcher, because I'm super fascinated. But there's just so much. And again, I know you and your listeners are aware of the complexity around the term misinformation and what it is. But for sure, again, that notion that parents can and should take control of their children's health, and if they do not do something right and things go awry, or you end up with an outcome you didn't want for your child, then that's your fault. I would say that's a major fallacy that runs through parenting, is part and parcel of the parenting discourse. So many others, of course, the idea that there are only two biological sexes. There are so many folks, even progressive-minded folks, who would believe that, at least in terms of the science, that there are only two biological sexes, and that's a fact. But it's, of course, so much more complicated than that, to the point that this notion is pretty much incorrect. In the same way, the idea that race or ethnicity are biological and they're in our race and ethnicity are in our blood and in our bones. I heard the other day that a friend actually the other day described their hair as like the country of their ancestry, which we're just so socialized with this notion that our race and ethnicity is in our cells and in our tissues, that it's so hard to break out of. And moreover, it seems so much more benign than this belief is. And so, yeah, I could keep going, but for sure, in terms of like maybe the most ridiculous yet alarming misinformation-related, parenthood-related story I've come across, which you would have read about in the book, is this furry panic and the rumor that that started in our state of Wisconsin, that children are being allowed to identify as whatever animal they choose, and therefore they're being provided litter boxes at school to relieve themselves. And it was amazing to me, unbelievable to me, how many people I knew in my own circles believed this furry panic rumor that progressive schools were allowing children to lick their paws in class and relieve themselves in a litter box. And this really all just boils down to perpetuating the notion that someone identifying as a gender other than what they were assigned as birth is preposterous and ridiculous, which is really not. It actually is science and science-based, that there are, that gender and sex are a spectrum.
From learning about human biology and neuroscience and psychology, you learn how complex human beings are, right? Just like among so many different dimensions. And once you think about that complexity, to me, just from a scientific perspective, it's like, of course, there's going to be variation in sex and gender and so many different things. Like, just when you have a group of people and you study them, there's all this type of variability, individual variability, just from our social backgrounds, but also our genetics and like all this stuff that makes us into unique persons.
For sure. And I would say along those lines, I should add that another like fallacy that subtly runs through people's minds and maybe people don't think about as much is just that there is a norm or default when it comes to all these traits or parameters, whether it be body weight or intelligence or neurodivergence or anything along those lines, that you're shooting for an optimal child, and there's a definition of that we should be striving for, which I try to dismantle in the book.
Yeah, no, I really like that whenever I was reading it. That definitely comes through as a major theme. Another topic I wanted to talk about from the book is the chapter on vaccines. So I've studied vaccines and vaccine attitudes for a few years now, and I really appreciated the amount of nuance you approach this subject with. And I think that's really important today, as vaccines are this very polarizing topic. And I liked how you mentioned how there's a wide view of people who we would put in this more vaccine skeptical camp. I think sometimes there's another binary presented where if anyone has any concerns about vaccines, they're anti-vax.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that people who are completely anti-vax are actually a small group of people when we think of like really strident views against vaccines. Instead, it's more of there's a broader group of people who have some concerns, but are not so ideologically opposed to vaccines. I guess I was curious to hear more of your thoughts on vaccination, but one specific question I had was when you were talking about the CDC, and you talk about the issues with the CDC and how that understandably leads to some mistrust regarding the CDC and different like health organizations. But then you also mentioned the CDC was correct in their vaccine scheduling because they had this independent group of researchers who studied the best way to implement these vaccines for kids. And I guess I'm curious, how do we delineate who to trust? Like, what parameters do you look for whenever you're thinking about a scientific organization or a group of scientists? Like, how do you know to trust this thing that they say, but not this other thing that they say?
It is so tricky. If we even just talk about the category of government agencies or again, organization, you could ask this question when it comes to my book about also the World Health Organization, for instance, and times when they are very correct and times where I argue that they're wrong. And I never imagined when I wrote this book, just for a bit of relevant backstory, manuscript was finalized at the end of 2023. And then published in August of 2024. And I never imagined that now we would be in this place where there's the question of RFK Jr. in the HHS. I mean, of course, if I'd known that, I would have maybe written the chapter a little differently, but even then, not so differently because, again, as you say, it's just simply not true that all people with questions or doubts about vaccines are in the RFK Jr. camp. And I think you might be referring to how I talk about the CDC's handling and mishandling of COVID.
Right. Yep.
And so to your question of how to determine when to trust and when not to trust the CDC, I don't have a short answer to that. I could write multiple essays on it. That's always my sweet spot is arguing and writing. One thing I would say is that we want to keep in mind generally, like not just with the question of vaccines, but generally these organizations or government agencies are largely looking at populations rather than individuals. And so when they're looking out for well-being or health or public health, again, their recommendations don't always apply totally equally to everyone. And could someone have a reaction to a vaccine? Yeah, it's possible and it happens, but it really just comes down to weighing risks and benefits. That can be tricky, but when it comes to the regularly scheduled vaccines, honestly, as somebody who doesn't really trust the CDC in a blanket sense, like that's one of the easiest decisions for me to make is getting all the vaccines.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. It's a very complicated question. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time diving into it. And it also references back to our point about human complexity with gender and sex. Like with medicine, there's so much variation in how medicines affect different people. And there's still so much we don't know about how that happens and the biology behind it. So it's why social science and medicine can be so challenging, because we try to have these population level effects that we see and that are statistically relevant, but it doesn't mean they apply to each unique person the same way. So I think it's an important point, and it could be really complicated for even people who do this kind of research. So I think it's helpful for academics and people who study this to try to communicate that as best they can. So I guess, yeah, on the question of trust, I think is such a big one now and moving forward. And I was curious if you could speak any more about that with vaccines or with finding information. I feel like trust is so dependent on different social factors. And there's a lot of academic research on this, like the perceived warmth that someone has actually plays a large role in whether you trust them. There's this social connection that matters so much. And when I think about the digital landscape, you can think about why someone might trust an influencer, like a health influencer they can see on TikTok or Instagram, like on their phone, and they have this like parasocial relationship with that person, and they develop trust with this person, even if their information is not the most evidence-based. And then you contrast that like one-on-one kind of connection to something more abstract, like a World Health Organization or a scientific body or just some faceless entity that people don't have that one-on-one connection with. So I was curious if you've thought about that and just how people can navigate trust in our digital age.
Right. I think this ties back to the idea of who the onus is on to ensure or encourage the well-being and thriving of children in this world. I recall being personally turned off when it came to the COVID pandemic and the vaccine finally being available, which was truly one of the most exciting times of so many of our lives, this prospect of being vaccinated against COVID. But we would keep hearing on the news pretty much everywhere about how vaccine uptake was going to be an issue because of this question of distrust. And the book touches on this, but specifically there was this discourse around why Black people specifically may distrust the vaccine because of historical injustices when it comes to medicine and medical research. The Tuskegee experiment came up a lot. And so it was almost implied and sometimes even explicitly put that, well, yeah, people are going to distrust the authorities because of all this stuff that happened a long, long time ago. And really, as we're seeing, and as I'm sure you're aware, there are atrocious things happening in our healthcare system and in doctors' offices and in hospitals like every day right now, especially to marginalized people of color, especially Black Americans. And so there's all of this talk of trust, but what are these government bodies or health agencies doing to actually earn trust? And that's the big question to me. Again, trust is in every incident when when I as a parent am put in a situation to either trust or not trust a doctor's advice or prescription. Let's say it's like a medication, and this I'm thinking of a medication that I was prescribed. I have fibromyalgia, and so I was prescribed gabapentin for pain, and that comes with like brain fog and everything. And so then I wanted to stop taking it. But the point I'm making is that there are so many medicines, and I write quite a bit about medicine in my work, in my freelance writing, that are kind of hit or miss, right? And we just don't know if it's going to work, and we don't know what side effects it's going to cause for people. And so, yes, as I write in the book, yes, vaccines are probably like the least, to me, one of the least questionable things to do, right, medically for ourselves and for our kids. But the onus for trusting vaccines should be, I mean, it makes sense to have a healthy level of trust versus distrust, and I could ramble all day. But really, what are healthcare systems doing to be considered trustworthy? In addition to talking about trust all day long until we turn blue, like, how about you be trustworthy?
Right. Yeah, no, it's such a great point, because I've seen different health officials and politicians and people related to those spaces. They talk about trust as something that is some kind of like checkbox. It's like, what do we need to check this box off? And like, if only we change our messaging a little bit, like all of a sudden, all these different groups of people are going to trust us more. And I agree, it's kind of a foolish way to think about it, or unproductive way, maybe is a better way to frame it. Because ultimately, a lot of that trust, like, there's a lot of reason why people distrust these groups. And you have to earn that trust by being transparent and authentic and working with these communities directly. And that takes time and effort. And it's not something that can be changed with simple messaging. I mean, of course, the messaging can be better. It's something I've talked about in my book and my work is, during COVID-19, a lot of the messaging was really poor, specifically with the very strong recommendations when we had very uncertain information. Like you probably remember at the beginning, it's like, don't wear a mask.
Yeah.
And then right after that, it's wear a mask. And like right there, that's really confusing for people, right?
Yeah.
Like just that one contrast, it can remove a lot of trust.
Yeah, for sure. It's huge.
Yeah. So it's going to be a challenging topic for sure. Definitely worth trying to pay attention to. So was there anything when you're writing this book, anything that surprised you or anything that you found particularly challenging to try to write about?
Yeah, I would say a few things were particularly challenging, but I can tell you about the title of the book, The Progressive Parent. Fun fact, so journalists don't typically write their own headlines, and often authors don't write their own title or choose their own title. And so when I had my book contract in hand and my editor's like, let's call it The Progressive Parent, I had pretty complicated feelings about the word progressive, because I know that so many people have opinions about the word progressive, and some people say it's sort of a virtue signal. Mm-hmm. But I came to understand that if we had to choose one word to tie together all of these values that I'm presuming my readers will have, so that is that we care about all children, not just our own. We do believe that love is love. We do believe that Black Lives Matter. And we do care about science. Like, that's the word that ties us together. So that in itself was like a broad challenge. And also as we honed in on the subtitle, harnessing the power of science and social justice to raise awesome kids, I guess you could say the biggest spoiler is in the dedication of my book. I dedicate it to my children, Asha and Jeevan, and I write in the dedication that they were born awesome. And that's kind of the point that the book is framed around, really, is that everybody is born awesome. Not that some kids aren't, annoying or very trying, or, adults for that matter.
Sure.
But really that all humans contain these prismatic universes of experience and perception that is really our job is to cultivate that, to help people thrive in their most authentic selves. And so that was a part of the framing that I also had to keep in mind, is that an awesome kid is your kid and is your neighbor's kid, and how do we take that view to heart?
Yeah, that's awesome. Definitely a beautiful message to end on. So I was curious, as we kind of wrap up our conversation here, are there any final messages you'd want to share with people as they navigate parenthood or just science, and anything that you'd want to talk about with my audience, or just more generally?
Oh, wow, there's so much. But one thing that we didn't get to delve into, but I hope people will, especially folks who are are pregnant or are thinking of becoming pregnant or having a newborn anytime soon is to really scrutinize the idea that exclusive breastfeeding is going to make or break your kid's well-being. Exclusive breastfeeding is this prescription, basically, that all newborns receive only human milk and nothing else for the first 6 months of life. And the second chapter of my book is titled Healthy Scrutiny of Science. And it's actually framed around this question of how to feed infants, because I would say if there was ever, the book itself sheds light on what consensus actually is. And if there was ever an idea in the parenting psyche that there's consensus on anything, it would be that, of course, breastfeeding your kids is good for them and it's going to lead to the best outcomes. And a pediatrician that I quote in the book says something to the effect of, this is just not the case. Breastfeeding or not is not going to make the difference between your kid like pole vaulting for Yale or struggling to make ends meet. And so, yeah, this is ending on an open question, but I hope people will read more about it. I've also written, I have an opinion piece a couple years ago in Scientific American. The title is It's Okay Not to Breastfeed. And so that might seem surprising to some people, but read it and begin to ask yourself questions, and you'll find, I got to recommend an organization that I respect quite a bit called the Fed is Best Foundation. They too have a book out, and they are all about highlighting the healthiest ways to feed a child that works for any family.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad we were able to include that in our show here. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'll definitely put links to the book and your website and anything else that you want me to include in the show notes so that people can find your work. Yeah, thank you so much for talking with me today.